if you repeat a lie after enough, it becomes truth/politics. And that's quite true, in that it's important when you're debating politics to remember that you're debating in debate land and not in the real world. And that becomes very important when you're thinking about trying to create a consistent and complete argument for a political position in 7 minutes, because that's almost impossible to do if you were to include every factor from the real world. So it's about picking the most important parts that you can get across your argument. So what we're going to talk about is the political spectrum, stakeholders, politics in debate land, some tactics for debating politics, and then this is the advanced group, so we will talk a little bit about the next steps of debating politics, and then we'll have about 20 minutes for questions and answers at the end. So, the traditional understanding of politics is that it's a spectrum from left to right. But if you can see that there, it's a bit of a bizarre way of categorizing politics. So, like, I thought this one was funny. So you've got like slavery on both sides, obviously, because only centres in this group. And apparently monarchism is more to the right than conservatism, and fascism is worse than Nazism. So there are lots of ways that you can break the spectrum. It's a useful way of thinking about kind of clash in a debate in two different sides of the debate, but it's worth bearing in mind that it is quite a bizarre and abstract way of thinking about politics. Like, I'm sure you're familiar with where left wing and right wing comes from. It's after the French Revolution, it's where people sat. So that's where it comes from. It's not from any actual theory or intelligent design. So then, a more kind of sophisticated way of thinking about it is that it's more of a matrix. And you've got left and right in terms of the way that you think about social issues, the way you think about whether or not people should come together to change things and improve things, or whether people should kind of do things by themselves, pull themselves up by the bootstraps. And that's kind of a traditional left and right. And then up and down you have anarchism and fascism, so slavery, on the other side. And that's the idea of the role of the state and how much you think the state should be involved in things. And then you've got random people mapped onto that. So if you think about kind of the more economic spectrum, which is the horizontal one, and you can kind of think about left versus right as how much you think the state owes people. And it's the idea of how much we should exist together and how much we should exist with other people. And then the right is the idea of kind of you should do it by yourself. What that boils down to within debates, though, is questions of who is best placed to help people. Because usually within debates, there's kind of a pretty nice supposition that we should help people, we shouldn't let people starve. It's usually kind of a starting assumption in most debates. So it's a question then of which is best for doing that. So is it better that the state helps you out, or that a group helps you out, or that it's better that you should be incentivized to try to figure things out by yourself? And then in terms of the vertical axis, in terms of how much control the state have over what you do. And this is kind of a more social issues thing. And that's a question of, should the state decide who gets to marry? Should the state decide how you should be educated? How much you should be educated? How you should raise your children? What books you should be allowed to read? All that kind of thing. And then the arguments kind of map on, because when you think about whether or not the state, again, is best placed to decide things like how children should be educated, or if individuals are better placed to do that. And that's a similar argument to the idea of who should help you out. So you can see that on both dimensions it comes down to the role of the state and how much you trust the state. But again, it's a bit of a bizarre thing. So I did the compass thing last time I was making these slides, and so I'm pretty more left-wing than Stalin and more libertarian than Freeman. So again, not everyone actually maps onto these things correctly. But we'll talk about, we'll talk about how they're useful. So where it's useful to think about your position in the debate on one of these spectrums is it allows you to have consistency. And consistency is one of the most important things in the debate. Because if you've got 3 points, and one of them kind of is over by Gandhi and the other one is down by me, for example, then it's very likely that your points will end up contradicting each other. And it'll be quite easy for someone on the other side to say, but if point 1 is true, then point 3 doesn't follow the same logic. So when you're thinking about your arguments, think about where it fits on those dimensions. And if they all match up, then you're much more likely to have a consistent argument, and it's much more likely that you're not going to be undercutting yourself accidentally. And it's important that's within your own speech, and also your partner's speech as well. The spectrum is also quite useful in terms of drawing on examples or analogies of similar positions. So for example, if you wanted to argue that the state is the best place to pay for the education of children, you think about what else is the state best place to pay for if you're existing in that quadrant. So things like healthcare, policing. So it's a good way to come up with, again, consistent examples. And on the other side, examples of where things go wrong. So if you want to go against that, you talk about, the state shouldn't probably decide what books should be on sale or what movies should be produced, that kind of thing. So it's a useful way of quickly coming up with examples that support your position without having to kind of develop them out of nowhere. Where it's quite limited then is the idea of case-by-case uniqueness, because likely many political debates don't really map on that accurately onto the political spectrum. And it can be useful to almost reject the spectrum and identify that you're existing outside of pre-existing understandings of the political divide. And then the other thing to be wary of is libertarian arguments, because they are very hard to map onto the spectrum, because there's a big distrust of the state, so it's kind of leaning towards anarchy, and the idea that the state shouldn't control you. It's very much about freedom, but it's also very much about individualism, which brings it over to a really kind of extreme corner. And you can get arguments based on the state being inefficient or dangerous, and that's the reason why we don't allow the state, rather than an argument that individuals should just suck it up and do it themselves. So libertarian arguments kind of are an example of arguments that exist outside of the box. Other examples would be things like environmental arguments very often don't map on that well, some feminist arguments as well. So be careful about using it across the board, but in kind of a standard politics debate about whether or not a policy should be implemented, it can be useful. So the next most important thing to think about when you're doing a politics debate is stakeholder analysis. So when you get a political debate like the state should X or the state should pay for X for everyone or something like that, well, the first thing you should do in prep is what's called a stakeholder analysis. I'm sure some of you have started doing this already. So you just get a blank piece of paper and you write down absolutely everyone you can think of who could be impacted by this policy. So anyone who might have to pay, anyone who might have to provide the service, anyone who would receive the service, anyone who used to provide a similar service and no longer will be able to, people who interact with the people who will be receiving the service, so if the service is for children, think about their parents, the rest of their family, and try to fill a whole page with those stakeholders and then pick out the ones that are most important. And what's important then, once you've decided who this debate is about, is you have to decide who matters the most. Because usually in any debate, if it's in any way a fair debate, amongst that list of stakeholders, some of them will benefit and some of them won't. And it will often come down to who matters more and who you should care about more. So it's important to think about it. You have to be both correct in that, it should be factually logical, it should be internally consistent, but also very often both sides can be internally consistent and be drawing on facts and be drawing on examples. And what it comes down to then is what's most important. And you can't just take for granted who is most important. So for example, if it's changing the way we educate children, for example, there could be different groups of children, different economic backgrounds, different genders, different nationalities, something like that. And usually you would go to the most vulnerable group and say that they're the most important because they're the most in need of protection. Also you can look at what's the biggest group, or who has the most impact from it. Or if someone has kind of been unfairly benefited, so for example, if teachers have been unfairly benefited from the system that we currently have, you're arguing to change the system, then it's okay that teachers lose out under this. So the most important group are the ones who currently not been doing well under it. So again, if both sides are correct, being important becomes the most crucial thing, and that's what the clash will actually become about. So the worst thing in a politics debate is we just have these competing definitions and competing understandings of the world. And often I see people with one side arguing from kind of an American history perspective, talking about policies in the US and examples from the US and the logic of how the state interacts with systems in the US, and another side talking from a more European side. And you don't get a real clash there because they're not actually arguing against each other, they're just arguing in two different directions. And it's very hard then for judges to evaluate who's actually winning the argument, and that's when you put yourself in a position where a judge just kind of goes with whichever one they feel more in tune to. So, like, if you have an American judge, they probably go with the American side, or if you're watching an awful lot of American TV, all that kind of thing. So, being important, though, is always going to create a clash, because you're always going to talk about your stakeholders versus their stakeholders. And in that case, it doesn't really matter which context you're working from. So that's an important thing to remember in terms of how to structure your debate and to prioritise your points within a debate on politics. So, politics and debate land. So, I'm sure some of you have heard of the idea of Prime Minister's prerogative. And this is the idea that the first speaker in first prop can get up and almost, to a certain extent, create the universe that the debate is happening within. So, for example, if the motion is something really bizarre and out there, like this has to provide, so you don't sound out there to me, but like this has to provide a minimum income to every citizen of €500,000 a year. That sounds like pretty implausible. But if the Prime Minister gets up and says, we will do this, then you can't stand up and say, no government would ever do this. You can't argue that it's implausible that a Prime Minister in the real world would actually make that declaration. So it's important that you don't attack kind of out there proposals or models just because you don't think they would happen in the real world. Because you have to imagine that the Prime Minister themselves is sitting in the room. And a lot of people can get kind of caught by that because you can find it, like you can make a really good argument and you can really hammer at them for being bizarre, for being absolutely ridiculous, and the judge won't actually pick up on that because you've missed the mark. Areas that you can attack that kind of model on is, for example, backlash. So the Prime Minister might get to choose this, but which groups are going to backlash against this? Might backbenchers revolt? Might the rest of his party revolt? Might business backlash and perhaps leave the country, that kind of thing. Alienation. Might this policy alienate huge amounts of the citizenry so they won't vote anymore, they won't contribute to civil society, that kind of thing. Is it a massive cost to political capital? Does this mean that your Prime Minister won't be able to provide healthcare or education or do anything else because they've used all of their political capital on this? And then there's also a clever one is co-option. So co-option means if the group that you identify almost as an enemy can take on this policy as their own and twist it. So, for example, if we stay with that example, we might see kind of very wealthy people co-opting that kind of minimum income in order to secure that minimum income for themselves, but then filling it with all kinds of caveats and limits and different tests to acquire that money. You might see things like banks making it very difficult to process that sort of minimum income, and making it very difficult for them to spend that money. Or something like that. So you can argue on those kind of four grounds, but be careful about never attacking just specifically whether or not a Prime Minister could ever imaginably propose something like this. Okay, so then different debating areas require different amounts of knowledge. Politics is probably somewhere in the middle. It doesn't require as much knowledge as, for example, international relations. So you don't need to know the name of the country that you're proposing this model. You don't have to know the name of the capital or whatever. But it does need more knowledge than, for example, a very principled debate. So the kind of knowledge that you should be trying to kind of keep in the back of your mind is like one example of specific political structures. So the difference between presidential and parliamentary systems. So presidential systems like the United States, where the president has the majority of power and it's what's called an executive role. And that's obviously the opposite to in Ireland, where one indeed doesn't have an executive role and is subservient to the Parliament, and the Parliament is in charge. So it's important to kind of have that kind of knowledge in order to understand who the actors are that you're talking about. You also need a certain amount of economic knowledge. And when we debating economics is often a lot easier than people think it is. So when you're debating right-wing economics, it's very often easier to convince a panel of judges of a right-wing argument than a left-wing argument. And the main reason for that is that most right-wing arguments are actually quite simplistic. So they work very well in debate land. It's the simplicity that often gets them into trouble in the real world, but within debate land they work quite well. So in terms of kind of the knowledge that you would use for the split between left and right-wing economics, so it's very much the idea of the state versus the market as to who is best placed to manage the economy. So if you're arguing that the state is best placed to manage the market, to manage the economy, then you have to have examples of areas where the state has driven things like growth or has decreased inequality. So you can talk about, for example, South Korea, where an awful lot of innovation is driven by state-funded kind of research centres and development centres. So all of kind of South Korea's computer companies, their car companies, started off being state-funded. So that's a great example of where the state has been good at directing economic growth. Obviously, then there are counter-examples where you could look at where vanity projects are funded by the state as opposed to actual growth, and where you can get economic decisions captured by general politics. In terms of on the right-hand side, and you're talking about the market being the best place. So the argument underlying that is that the market allows the democratization of decision making. So if every consumer is making an individual decision, then it collects together, and then you can actually have a more democratic decision. The real key to defending the market is that the closer the decision is to the people impacted by the decision, the better the decision is. So the idea is that the people who are actually spending their own money have more knowledge than the state can ever have. So the state can never know exactly what, engineers within Google actually know. So they have better knowledge, and that the market is much better placed because of that difference in knowledge. The second thing then is consistency. And consistency really matters in politics because you can draw on so many real-world examples to undercut people. So it's important to decide when you are doing your prep, to decide what principle is underlying it. So are you defending the state's role in governing the economy, or are you going for the market? And test all of your arguments against that. Because again, if you tie yourself up in knots, it's really, really easy for another student to knock you down. And when you do it to an extreme, then the judges just have to pick between two competing arguments that you've made, and they can't value both of them. The next thing then is elaboration, also known as analysis. So I'm sure you've all heard needs more analysis. That's kind of an easy way for judges to say you just didn't do enough. And that's incredibly important for debating politics because it's very, very easy to fall back on examples or buzzwords when you're trying to debate economics. So it's very easy to kind of just say something like, well, the market knows best, the market will solve, for example, without actually elaborating on that. And it's very hard there if you've got this side being like, the market will solve, this side being like, but the state is amazing, because it's really hard to evaluate that. So how do you elaborate on that is like one, two examples, but also just asking why several times over and over. So, for example, if you're asking why should the state do that? Well, one, because the state has the capacity to do it much more so than individual actors have. The state is less likely to be trying to extract profits at the same rate that individual market actors are, so you actually get more efficient use of it. So coming up with several reasons why is really important. And I think one of the dangers is that within debating there are kind of trends where it kind of swings between left and right. I'm not sure where it is right now because I've been debating for a little while, but when I finished up it was very much swinging to the left, and if you can kind of prove yourself to be on the left side, you could assume that you were correct. A few years before that, you could get back to the first principle of the market solves, you had finished the argument. And the problem with that is, one, if you've got judges like me who aren't kind of in the zeitgeist of debating, and we're like, well, I thought we were all against the market, or especially you find when you go outside of Ireland, for example. So, I mean, if you win the Mace and go to the International Mace, for example, they might, in most Irish competitions, so it's really important that you get into the habit of proving as if you have someone who is, like, if you're running a left-wing argument, imagine you've got Milton Friedman chairing your panel, and you have to prove it to such an extent that it's logically consistent that he has to give you win, or likewise, like pick someone left-wing. The other thing then is the idea of appeals to authority, which is really, really dangerous when you're debating politics. So, for example, like, you see people kind of saying, well, Paul Krugman thinks, or something like that, and that's, I think, happens in politics debate almost more than any other type of debate, because political debates happen more often in kind of mainstream media and in kind of general, like, political debates in parliaments and things like that. And there's really never any reason to appeal to authority in a politics debate. One, because it's just incredibly dangerous. You don't know if that person has come out and said something stupid since you last read something they read. You don't know if there's someone who's taken them down in a different newspaper in a really effective way, and that basically you've handed a pre-written argument to the opposition. So be very careful of appealing to authority, even not just appealing to names, but appealing to specific theoretical ideas. So, for example, like appealing to the idea of austerity is bad, which is quite like a commonly held belief right now within politics. It's very dangerous to appeal to those, because if that authority isn't familiar to the judges, then that's just a waste of your time. And they're kind of being like, well, maybe they should have got that guy in today, but he knows more than these guys do. So So there's no reason to ever, and there's also no reason to abuse the authority of other debaters, which I'm sure you can never do, but I've seen people do that and it's really unimpressive, so don't ever do it. So we'll jump back to the questions and we'll do some of the more advanced things, but are there any burning questions right now? Excellent. Because it's really clear or because you're not really getting it all? Okay. So this is the advanced group. Well done, me. So in terms of kind of, that's the basic, that's how you kind of, what we always need to talk about is how not to lose. So all of that stuff previous, that's how you get up to a second, like a guaranteed second in every politics debate. This is the stuff that you kind of start thinking about in terms of how to win the break group, how to get through a semi-final, how to win against really good teams, how to take down a really good team that's kind of in a long position, like if they're in the first half, you're in the second half, or something like that. So it's ways to kind of bring yourself up into the 80s, if you know what I mean. So it's kind of how to bring it up to the next step. So kind of, I made a lot of fun of the political spectrum and the idea of things outside the box. And it's quite useful to recognise that most people when they're debating politics are debating within that spectrum and are thinking about things on that spectrum. And if you have the ability within your prep time to develop an argument that exists outside of that spectrum, it can be very hard for them to quickly come up with a response to that and to rebuttal to that. So like I mentioned a few at the start, for example, environmental issues don't really map onto that spectrum. One, because the issue kind of is an impetus for environmental change, for change how we interact with resources on this planet, and it's an existential threat in a way that deciding whether the market or the state to be in charge just isn't an existential threat. So when you're talking about environmental issues, you can go completely outside of the traditional spectrum, and you can do things that would combine, for example, let's see, like incredibly state-based, state-enforced libertarianism, if that was to solve the impending environmental crisis. And it's worth bearing in mind that those arguments can be incredibly useful if you have to win. So for example, if you're in a semi-final and a third is as good as the last, or if you're in a break room that only one team can get out of, then do think about those arguments that exist completely outside of the spectrum. The second thing then is the idea of debating capitalism. And it's important, like, attacking capitalism or embracing capitalism is a very, very good extension point. If you're in a very good room and the first half kind of covers all of the ground on the political issue, attacking capitalism as, if you think of capitalism as the organising structure of all of our society, so any political change has to interact with the capitalist structure that we exist within. So either embracing capitalism and saying that capitalism will enhance this in a great way, or capitalism won't ever let this stand, is a good way of kind of bringing an extension. You can also attack capitalism and say that no matter how well-intentioned the state policy is, it'll just get corrupted within a capitalist system. So, like, if you go to a very basic definition of capitalism, which is the idea of extracting profit, i.e. capital, so always trying to extract this idea of profit, which leads to things like always having to have credit existing within your society. Those kind of factors often don't get considered when you're debating political issues. They're a good way to bring an extension that no one else would have thought about, and that the team on the other side of you will have to scramble to come up with an answer to. Another kind of good extension point is the idea of political parties. Because all political systems that we'd be debating about, except for a few authoritarian ones, have political parties. And there's a lot of argumentation out there right now about the collapse of political parties. So, for example, in every developed nation, the membership rates of political parties is declining massively. There's also arguments that political parties have become what's called corporatist parties, where their only interest is maintaining the power of the state, because they're likely to have at some point access to that power. So they're much more likely to always want the state to be powerful, even if they're in opposition. And that's really dangerous, because it means that if you ever have a population who wants the state to have less power, they're actually unlikely to get traction with those political parties. A great example of how out of touch political parties are becoming is the Scottish referendum, where SNP wins at the local election levels actually predicted a no vote, and the Labour vote at the local elections actually predicted a yes vote, and those parties were campaigning for the opposite side. So there's a real decline in political parties, and it can be useful in a debate about kind of interaction with government, kind of the voting, whether or not people should vote, to attack political parties. And I think it's kind of an innovative way to attack the political system without just going after the state, but actually finding one specific actor within the state structure that is failing. Another one then is the question of globalisation. You will be having a workshop on international relations. This isn't quite international relations, but it's worth bearing in mind that the realm of possibility for governments now is shrinking massively because of globalisation. So we all know that in Ireland, very much so, that what the government can do is limited hugely by international economic structure, by supranational organisations like the EU, by organisations like the WTO, for example. So those are kind of forces that you can attack to say that a policy is implausible. Because if, for example, if someone was proposing something around with protectionism, you could talk about the amount of fines that would result in. You could talk about how other traders would create protectionism themselves, and that would get reports within society. So it's important, again, if you're trying to really go for it and win a debate, or if they've scorched earth in the first half, you're in the second half. If you can look outside of just the political debate between opposition government and state powers and look at what forces exist outside, you can also attack those forces as evil. For example, ratings agencies are pretty terrible organisations, but they have a huge impact on what governments can and can't do. Then there's the question of, is democracy itself in decline? Because there's a starting assumption in most debates that, the famous quote, democracy is the worst system of government except for all the others. But it's becoming more and more challenged in more academic discourse. Democracy is very much under attack. Partly because of capitalism, the decline of political parties and globalisation, but also because of the rise of alternative options. So there are countries that aren't democratic that are doing pretty well, because they have an awful lot of oil money, for example, certain countries in the Gulf, or a country like Singapore that has a massively booming economy but without democracy. Because it used to be that we connected democracy with capitalism and therefore with growth, and that was during the Cold War we thought that was what was pushed. But as everyone starts to forget about the Cold War and countries move on, that connection between democracy and growth has fallen apart. So if democracy can't provide things like economic growth, like jobs for example, then it is becoming more possible within debates to attack democracy. So again, if you're in first doc or second doc and first doc get up there, there's really well thought out, narrow, neat proposal for a tiny change that will benefit a small number of people, case closed. Then you can talk about the process of that decision, whether or not it's legitimate, and you can attack just the very idea of democracy. The final thing then is judge and room awareness. And if you've been debating for a while, you'll know most of your judges, you'll know their general political position. And it's worth bearing that in mind, not to pander to them, but to know how much time to spend proving the point they disagree with. Because most judges won't just disregard a position they disagree with, but they will fill in the answers for a position they do agree with. So be very careful about getting used to judges filling in arguments for you, because if you get one judge who doesn't buy into that, they just won't do that subconscious work for you. So those are a few things to be thinking about in terms of innovative arguments that you can start making within debates, especially debates that you have to win, so the break room where only one team gets through. Start thinking about something a bit out there and a bit new that people won't have heard of and won't have a response quite ready for. So does that all make sense? Okay, so then questions. Those are the suggested questions, you don't have to ask them to know.
What is scariest when taking the right wing position?
That people will think you're mean. But it's shocking how much better people debate when they take a counterintuitive position. You fill in the gaps much better. You break the steps down more simplistically. So there really is no danger to taking a right wing position. And try to practice it if you're doing practice debates and stuff like that. Because it's, like I say, they're very simple arguments. And they make a lot of sense when said out loud. It's very often in the actual practice that they fall apart, but the principles behind them do make a lot of sense.
So a recent thing that we've been seeing in a lot of reasonably good Irish streams when we're doing policy that arguments are brought in about what effect this would have on support and the supporting nature of right-wing populists, the far-right fascist groups, etc. And I'm just wondering if you would like any thoughts about how to debate around those sort of arguments, because they're becoming like increasingly salient.
Okay. So this is the what will the bigots do?
Yeah.
Okay.
What will the bigots do? Like, will people support bigots more because we do this sort of stuff? Like.
Yeah, I think those are. Yeah, I know what you mean by those arguments. So you can say like, well, the Daily Mail will have a field day kind of thing with this policy. Yeah. I think. Like the first line of defence against that is to say something like, the Daily Mail isn't going anywhere, and they find things anyway. And then a little bit of kind of media analysis of they don't need an actual thing to start with. The point is fear, and they're not driven by ideology, these groups. So they won't get up in arms just because you've implemented left-wing policy. What's much more likely to send them to create kind of these fear-mongering front pages is if their subscriptions are down, or if their sales are down, their advertising is down. So one, are you going to start subsidising the Daily Mail just to keep them happy and keep them sweet? And two, at what point, it actually most likely will lead to the same level of outrage if they're actually happy enough with their sales. Because they're economic factors. Most of them aren't owned by people who live within the state. Most of them are owned by international conglomerates now. A lot of them are selling to international groups now, like our international audiences, so like Daily Mail Online, for example. So the actual connection between a government policy and what ends up on the front page of the Red Tops isn't actually as clear-cut as you might think. I think as well it's always worth kind of pointing out the way that people then respond to those kind of media arguments and how effective they actually are. And it's things like, depending on the level of education, is the level of salience that these things have. So yeah, exactly, we should educate people more as well. Thanks very much. That's a great idea. Also, there's examples of where those kind of really fear-mongering responses to government policy can create a backlash. So, that kind of mode you can throw at those kind of arguments that can be useful.
You're seeing one that's more geopolitical, but say in motion that asks you to defend an outdated political institution like regretting the demise of the USSR. In one sense, are you able to extrapolate from where they were at the time and then move forward from that, or should you just take the history of the institution?
So this has regrets the demise of the USSR?
Yeah, that was very final.
Okay. So your question is, do you regret that the USSR doesn't exist anymore, or do you regret the consequences of the demise of the USSR?
Yeah, but how would you set target arguments in that way? As say first part.
I probably go for the consequences of the demise of the USSR rather than I still wish we had the USSR. So then you can start talking about it's really shit that we live in a unipolar system, and then you could compare the harms of the American hegemon to the harms of the USSR, and you look at things like imprisonment rates, wars, death, food prices globally. Then you can talk about so the consequence of the demise of something like that. I think would probably be smarter than saying we wish we could all go back to another Russia. Does that make sense? And I think what you want to do first off is kind of very brazenly create a comparison between the harms of being in a unipolar system and what happened in the USSR. Because otherwise the whole debate would just be opposition being like, well, the gulags, and if you can kind of be willing to say, no, we've got a response to that already, and we factor that into our argument, that would be kind of a good way to defend it. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what I would do.
Quite smart was to say that the USSR didn't break up. It's quite likely that it would have progressed in a more democratic direction over the course of the last whatever years. And just try to analyse that by that would be the case.
You could look at the impact on kind of the former members of the USSR and kind of where are they now would have a more structured liberation rather than breakup have been better.
How would you approach debates that revolve around excluding people or actors from the democratic process? I remember last year UCD there was a motion about suspending Hungary from the EU if that really horrible fascist party gets elected.
Or keeps getting elected.
Yeah.
If they were allowed to participate in government, I think it was.
Oh, so not the government party, one of the...
No, if it's job.
Okay. Yeah. Like, well, excluding from the EU is different from excluding from general politics. Like, I think there's the famous example of the 5% threshold in Germany. So the German government has, you have to reach 5% in both. They have two different electoral structures, but you have to reach 5% in both of them in order to get access, not just to government, but to parliament, to sit in parliament. And the reason for that is to keep neo-Nazi groups out of politics. So even if people vote for them, even if 4% of Germans, quite a lot of people vote for them, they still don't get access. And the reason for that is to suppress those kind of ideas. In terms of keeping someone out of the EU, like, I think you can definitely talk about what they signed up for, because it's not the same as democracy in a state where you don't really have another option. Like, they signed up to the acquis communautaire, and they signed up to the ECHR, you know, all this kind of thing. And like, for example, they cut the aid to Bulgaria because they weren't meeting fundamental rights a couple of years after Bulgaria first joined, and that did actually lead to change. And it led to, I think it was about a language issue, and because of that cut aid, they actually stopped it. I think it's a law banning a certain language being taught in schools, and they got rid of that. You can also kind of defend, like, the EU in terms of how the EU does soft power in Turkey, but Turkey's kind of lost the run on itself. But in terms of dealing with reporters, like, the corruption right now is very different and somewhat less perverse than the way Turkey was treating reporters when they were negotiating with the EU, and because of the EU refusing to allow them to get candidate status, they actually did. There was a guy who was on death row who got changed to a life sentence, for example. So you can say then that it's like the EU has a duty to use its power, whatever power it does have, to actually affect that kind of change. And then finally, I would say that, you know, it's not about the participation of elites within an EU state, it's about the individuals within the EU state, because membership of the EU isn't like membership of the UN. Like, Enda Kenny isn't the only member, the Irish member of the EU. We all have EU passports. So it's our rights as well as their rights. So I think breaking apart Hungary into different stakeholders would make it easier to talk about excluding them from something. That makes sense. Any other questions?
Can you argue economics with an economist?
Yeah, it's great fun. Yeah, I think a lot of people have been quite scared of, because economic jargon can be quite off-putting and quite impenetrable if you're not familiar with it. And that's where it kind of comes back to going for the most important point as opposed to the most correct point. And you'd be like, yeah, I can do whatever it wants to the Phillips curve, but people are starving, you know? I think that's one of the easiest ways to infuriate and to beat economists in an economics debate. And kind of being quite clear that you are willing to concede that they might be correct on the macroeconomic issue, but you are choosing to defend a policy or attack a policy based on real life impacts. You can also kind of do economic arguments if you have that familiarity, and you shouldn't be kind of just frightened because someone is using that kind of jargon, because people think that economics is much more internally consistent than it actually is. People think that there are certain positions that economics has proven, that no one disagrees with that, and that's just not the case. And like within economics, absolutely everything is up for debate. And the best thing about economics is that you can always say, yeah, well, that's originally an ideal model situation, because that's the basis of the economic discipline. And that you can't argue that, that's factual. So, yeah. Any other questions? Burning questions about debating in general? I don't know.
Just in terms of like a slight follow-up to what's going on there. Like, what do you think the best way is to present an argument when, like, you're saying, like, well, we don't particularly care about like economic growth. We care about the specific issue, or because often when you like present an argument like that, like you think this particular policy
the economic growth argument is going to become more and more difficult to sustain the more we start talking about the environment. And when you've got an economic model that's built on consistently sustainable, sustainable economic and environmental growth for here on out, that just isn't plausible with the resources we have on this planet, then you can start talking about the fact that we're going to have to face up to a different economic model that isn't based on growth, that focuses more on distribution. You can also respond by saying that's bullshit. Economic inequality has grown massively. People aren't like there's all the stats like middle class workers are earning slightly less than they were earning in the 70s, all that kind of stuff. But like this growth actually isn't spreading at all. So that's nonsense. I think you could also throw in something about the Gini coefficient and how it's actually a better predictor of economic stability and not quite growth, but like diversification within your economic structure. And that's the happiness coefficient. So, like, you can talk about kind of the idea, the Gini coefficient is inequality, and there's the happiness coefficient as well. So, we can talk about these other measures that are turning out to be better predictors than just GDP or GNP. And you kind of get so you can either go with economics as nonsense, or you can go with I've got fancier kind of jargon than we do. So, there's two ways you can do both at your time. Okay, I think we're done for time, but any other questions?
What would be the resource for entry level economics? Say you do nothing but campus and you're trying to get that.
To be brutally honest, the best thing you can do is find an economics textbook, like a PDF online, and go to the back to the glossary of terms. Get the that. If you get one thing, get the terminology. And that's a bit of a cheat but if you I find especially through, as a woman, usually in most of my rooms about economics, if I could throw out the jargon, it would raise my credibility quite a lot. And then you can just make arguments that you logically yourself, if you can kind of, and you're not backing up with any factual knowledge you gain, but you just you gain a lot of credibility. So if you can do one thing, it would be that. Other than that, the Keynes versus Hayek videos? YouTube, Keynes versus Hayek. It's a rap battle between Friedrich Hayek and Keynes, and it breaks down their positions quite well. I get most of my stuff from economics Twitter, but I don't know. You can learn about the EU. The EU is quite useful one because you can unless you're trading the world, you can bring stuff back to why the EU will or not allow this and stuff like that. And again, that seems smarter than just debates that are domestically based. So if you want to learn about one structure, learn about the